Afternoon. All right, CIT, the country's largest small business lender, is on the brink of collapse. The company may have two choices: bailout or bankruptcy. And that's where all of us come in, taxpayers. And the big question: should taxpayers bail out CIT or let it go the way of Lehman? It has been a while since we've had a financial institution of any significant size really up on the dock for potential failure. Dan Mitchell is with us, senior fellow at Cato Institute. Christian Weller, senior fellow at the Center for American Progress. Lloyd Chapman, president of the American Small Business League, and our own David Faber. David, let's begin with you. I mean, we remember the days 6, 8 months ago when this company was on the brink virtually every day. They got through it. They got some TARP money. And now, what exactly is the situation? Is this potentially the quote-unquote next example?
Well, they have a looming liquidity crisis. It's not a solvency crisis as of yet, but it's a liquidity crisis. They have some maturities coming due in August and then a very large maturity coming due in April of next year. The value of the collateral that they have lent against, in many cases, is declining in value. And so there is uncertainty, certainly to say the least, amongst potential credit market investors about buying unsecured debt of CIT. They've simply been unable to do so. The key to this company's business, in part, is access to the debt capital markets for liquidity for its selling unsecured debt. Unable to do that, Erin, and you're looking ultimately in them being unable to meet the funding gap that they currently have. They have tried to go to the FDIC and get it to allow them to issue under the TLGP program, but as of yet, that has not been allowed, despite the fact that this company was the recipient of $2.3 billion worth of TARP money. So you've got a situation where with $5.3 billion in unfunded commitments to many businesses, in other words, I have that line of credit, they're now starting to pull it down. If you're a business that's been lent to by CIT and you haven't borrowed the money yet,
you're going to pull it down, and that's where the liquidity comes in. That, of course,
exacerbates what's already a bad situation.
And Lloyd, why don't you step in here to explain? We had said at the top of the program, CIT may seem esoteric to many people, but it is the largest leasing company to small businesses in the nation, right? And as it has not received some of these key government initiatives or help, right, other much larger competitors like GE, right, have.
Absolutely. In fact, I was just reading today that GE Capital is really in a similar situation of CIT, and the government backed $108 billion in bonds for them. CIT is the #1 lender to small business in America for 9 consecutive years, the #1 lender to women, minorities, and veteran-owned firms for 6 consecutive years. They've loaned money to people successfully that other banks, wouldn't work with. And I think they're way too valuable for the government to let them fail, and it wouldn't take that much to help them. They received $2.3 trillion, $2.3 billion in TARP funds.
That's right.
J.P. Morgan got $25 billion.
Right. Now, Dan, what do you say here? I mean, they could be very important. Again, this gets to the question. They're in the small business arena, so too big to fail in that arena may not be as big as a J.P. Morgan. Should we let them fail if they have not run their business in such a manner that they could succeed without government help?
If this company is so valuable and so effective and so successful, they wouldn't be trying to stick their snouts in the public trough. They should fail. Now, I say that as someone who wants Goldman Sachs and all the big firms and GE Capital. I think they deserve to fail even more. I think it's reprehensible.
I was about to say, speaking of sticking nose in the public trough, we all have, right?
Yeah, and the big boys who have used their campaign contributions and their lobbyists to get access to $25, $50, $100 billion, that really should gall every taxpayer out there. But that doesn't justify giving 2.3 or 5.3 or 8.3 trillion to CIT. We have to stop the hemorrhaging of red ink. We have to stop the corrupt insider deal-making in Washington, because otherwise our economy is going to continue to fall off a cliff.
Now, Christian, the only mitigating factor potentially here, I mean, I'm sure there's many, but one that comes straight to my mind is the majority of jobs in this country come from small business. And CIT directly deals with small business. Now, that may not mean that we're going to lose jobs if we don't save CIT, but it might in some cases, or no?
Well, I think there's two separate issues here. The first one is, I think, actually like looking for the silver lining here, that this is not really like It is actually a non-story. We're not tearing our hairs out. CIT is falling. The whole system is crashing. And that really shows that we've returned to some normalcy in the markets and that the government has helped to really stabilize the markets. Or it could just mean
the people that deal with CIT are small and don't have as loud of a voice.
Well, but that's the second question, and I think that's something that people familiar with CIT have been looking at for a number of months now. And there are other players in that market, and I think in the end, that is a separate question. If CIT is the primary player in the small, medium-sized business market and it won't be allowed to fail because of that, then we have a competition problem. And that needs to be addressed in the future through effective competition policy. But I think the major news that I take from this is the non-news. The fact that we're not sitting here and saying, like, oh, we're panicking like we did with Bear Stearns or Lehman Brothers, that we're actually sitting back calmly discussing what should happen. And I think part of the assessment is the crucial or the strategic role that CIT plays for the small and medium-sized enterprises. And it does seem that there are other players in the market who could fill a hole relatively quickly.
Now, David Faber, could you weigh in on that? And also, perhaps the most important question, which is who's going to make the decision here?
Right.
Someone in Washington's making the decision.
Well,
who?
yeah, you know, I'm trying to get insight into this. I wish I could offer you more. I mean, I think it's interesting that the FDIC administers the TLGP program. And, of course, Treasury administered the TARP, under which they already borrowed at CIT $2.3 billion. Is there a division between the way Treasury sees the world and the way FDIC under Sheila Bair does, and a willingness to bail out? That's certainly a question here. I can't give you an answer. You know,
I mean, the assumption is also that the two will talk to each other. And I think overall, especially under the leadership between FDIC and Treasury, there is a discussion happening on what's the proper role of the government going forward. And to a large degree, that means ultimately for Geithner and Sheila Bair, how do we withdraw ourselves? How do you draw down the engagement in these banks where the government has ownership stakes?
But there also may be some disagreement in that discussion as you describe it.
Yeah,
otherwise we would have seen, I mean, why should GE Capital get TLGP money and not CIT?
Yeah. Right. I mean, that not ultimately
because they have better lobbyists.
Well, I'm not sure that this is a lobbying argument. I mean, clearly, this is a size argument, and that ultimately, and this is probably a point where Dan and I agree on, that in the future, we need to take a hard look at the consolidation in some market segments that will drive this need to bail out the ones who are too big to fail. And how do you actually structure competition policies so that you avoid this from happening again in the future? And that, I think, is a good discussion. It's a good regulatory discussion to have happen at this point with the banks.
Lloyd, do you think that it's fair to say that, and I'm sure there's other players in this, but obviously GE, one of the biggest, and CIT dealing with the smaller companies, it's fair to say that GE got access to GLP because they were more politically powerful or connected than CIT, or is that not true?
I don't think there's any question. Absolutely. When you look at the two companies, their financial situation is very similar. I think it's important for people
I want to
realize...
make one quick distinction for GE here. You do have the parent GE behind GE Capital.
Yeah. Right.
And that's important.
Which CIT does not have.
No.
Yes.
No.
And Lloyd, that may be enough to make GE make the cut where CIT does not.
Okay. It's important to remember that small businesses are responsible for half the GDP, 95% of the new jobs, and so far President Obama has given small businesses less than 0.5% of the $2.5 trillion in bailout funds. And CIT was one of the most effective vehicles for small businesses to get loans. In fact, President Obama has been bragging about...
But the key thing to understand is that if we want a healthy small business sector, we don't want them becoming dependents on the federal government. We should be cutting tax rates, reducing regulations, shrinking the size of government. I worry that our business community, big and small, are becoming a bunch of heroin addicts on government dependency.
Dan, Christian, Lloyd, David,
thank you very much.
Thanks very much to all of you.
Thank you.
We appreciate your taking the time.